I love it when a bar or bat mitzvah celebrant whose passion is, let's say, caring for animals, is assigned the Torah portion, Noach. It makes the writing of the Devar Torah so much easier. But if they do not get that lucky, I always assure them that as the Pirkei Avot teaches with regard to the Torah, hafachba v'hafachba v'kulaba, turn it over, and everything is contained within it. So even if they are stuck, for instance, with our Torah portion this week, Pekudei, there is always a way to find a connection to their given topic, somehow, usually. This evening, my luck was not so good. This is my first sermon having returned from my sabbatical, you see, and wouldn't it have been wonderful if the Torah portion of the week was Bahar, in which the concept of sabbatical is introduced to the world for the very first time. Sabbatical, related to the Hebrew word Shabbat, a pause every 7th year, allowing one's fields to lie fallow in order to reinvigorate the soil and perhaps the farmer as well. But Nebuch, Pekudei is comprised mostly of a list of the materials used in the building of the tabernacle. Even I could not figure out a way to tie that into the concept of sabbatical. Or maybe I can. Because the very first materials listed in our Torah portion are nuggets of gold. Keep that in mind as I offer this report on my very first ever sabbatical, what I accomplished and what I learned. But first, an explanation. Why a sabbatical now after 38 years? After all, most rabbis in our movement receive a sabbatical every 7 years, based on the Torah portion, Bahar, which alas is not our Torah portion this evening. Frankly, Temple Israel has never been able to offer that perquisite, as we have always run very lean clergy-wise. Typically, a rabbi serves about 300 or 400 families. What our movement deems killer congregations are those in which one rabbi serves 600 families. Historically, our rabbis have each served about 900. Thus, if one of us would have gone on sabbatical, the ones left behind would have plotzed from overwork. We still are over the national average, but we now have enough clergy coverage to support a sabbatical here and there, and also to allow members of our clergy to serve camps and go to Israel for study and so on. And our executive committee was foresighted enough to recognize that offering time for clergy members to let their fields lie fallow, if you will, to spend time working on new projects or skills, is actually in the best interests of the congregation. I am very grateful to them, and especially to my colleagues who so generously stepped up to shoulder more than their fair share of the burden while I was away. As I wrote to them on the very last day, I do sincerely hope to someday return the favor. Still, to take my 3-month sabbatical all at once would have overwhelmed our clergy staff. So I will be spreading it out over the next 4 years. Now to Tachlis. At first, I was a bit paralyzed by the prospect and the freedom of sabbatical. In the past, each of my publications has had a specific objective and a deadline. Temple Israel needed a new Siddur, or my publisher had offered a contract for me to produce a specific literary project. This is the very first time in over 40 years that I have had the opportunity to write without any set parameters whatsoever. And I found the prospect terrifying. After much internal tossing and turning, however, I did eventually land on 5 potential projects: an accessible book on Kabbalah, a novel based on the extraordinary story, the true story, of one of my father's counseling patients during the Holocaust, an emotional guide to wedding planning, a contrarian self-help book based on a High Holy Day sermon I once gave called Loving More by Caring Less. And finally, a book entitled Sermon Starters. You see, when my dad retired from his congregation, he realized that no one wanted to read a Best Sermons of Stanley Yedwab book, which is what many rabbis self-publish at the end of their careers. Instead, his dream was to publish a book entitled Sermon Starters. His concept was that other preachers, rabbis, might benefit from a compendium of just those original, surprising, compelling opening metaphors at which he was so adept. When dementia set in, he made me promise that I would endeavor to fulfill his dream. And to that end, he bequeathed to me a very large box filled with 40 years of his sermons. A box that has been staring down at me from its basement perch ever since. Of course, filial guilt eventually won out. And so in the months prior to my sabbatical, I digitized those of his sermons that were typed and transcribed those that were handwritten, and thus spent the first half of this sabbatical segment extracting those metaphors into a sermon starters document. In the process, however, I began referring to them instead as nuggets. Nuggets of homiletical gold, if you will. You see, I told you I could bring in the Torah portion, turn it over, and everything is contained within it, indeed. In any case, my definition of a nugget was that it must be original, timeless, and impactful. His recounting of a famous midrash, for instance, might have been sermonically effective, but not original. His personal story about the time his son Paul misbehaved in school might have been original, but not universal enough to stand the test of time. With that task concluded, I intended to move on to one of my other projects. But something kept nagging at me and pulling me back. Finally, I succumbed and began to do the same for my own sermons. And during my next sabbatical segment, I plan to do the same for my eulogies and wedding charges as well. Just one illustration of how important these nuggets of homiletical gold just might be. In my practical rabbinics course at HUC, we were taught that all eulogies should begin with a reference to the weekly Torah portion or some other Jewish text. And this was my practice until at a funeral intake early in my career, the deceased's family shared a story about her sock drawer that was so poignant, I decided to use it as the organizing metaphor for the eulogy. That sock drawer metaphor changed the course of my career. And yet, 30-something years later, I cannot remember the name of the deceased, nor the emotional significance of the drawer. Perhaps I will uncover it during my next sabbatical. So, here is how it worked on a practical basis. Each morning for 3 weeks, except on Shabbat, I set aside 4 hours to concentrate on my sabbatical project. This was not easy on Wendy, but not only was she understanding, indeed, she was the one who prodded me to stay true to that discipline, no matter what tempting distraction may have arisen. Pickleball at 11? No, Paul cannot play until 1. To be fair, though, while it is true that she did have to spend those hours alone, it is also true that they were generally spent at a beautiful pool or beach. Now, I have not been a full-time student in a very long time. And as it turns out, spending 4 hours each day researching and writing is not as easy as it may seem. I had originally scheduled 1 week of vacation time at the end of my 3-week sabbatical period. Halfway in, I realized that I was losing focus. So instead, we moved the vacation week earlier and left for a remote island eco-resort to which I did not bring my laptop nor any reading material heavier than a beach novel. Basically, I needed a sabbatical from my sabbatical. I also had the chance to be a congregant for the first time in decades. Every Friday evening, Wendy and I would venture to the beautiful shul with the sand floor. I sometimes quip that I became a rabbi partly because I knew that I would make such a terrible congregant. And as it turns out, there was some truth to that. But I did find the services interesting and often illuminating. Still, it was a bit strange to find myself in the pews. Once at dinner, Wendy was discussing with some new friends what it was like to be the rabbi of such a large congregation. You must not be able to go out to dinner or for a walk in the mall, they mused, without a congregant coming up and schmoozing or asking questions or even seeking counsel. The very next afternoon, we were walking in town and just happened upon the rabbi strolling with her parents. Wendy approached her and they schmoozed. But when I heard Wendy asking about one of the temple programs that weekend, I grabbed her elbow and said, "Come on, Wendy, let's let the rabbi continue her walk in peace." Now, it was important for me to be able to report to you what I was doing those weeks away. After all, it was really you, the members of this congregation, who supported this sacred opportunity. And I have now accomplished that to the best of my ability. But this is a sermon. And so I want to conclude by sussing out some nugget of meaning that we can all glean from my sabbatical experience. And here it is, right out of our Torah portion. If you go home this evening and look closely at the tabernacle that you have created for yourself, you will undoubtedly find nuggets of emotional gold all around. Those family photos on the shelf, or that piece of art you picked up on a special vacation, a Hanukkah menorah made by a child in nursery school, or a diary or collection of letters. Shabbat Pekudei is a time for recognizing and cherishing those sacred golden nuggets. But that process should not be limited only to the physical ones. Ask yourself, what events in my own history, my own personal history, rise to the level of sermon starters? Great stories that have punctuated the grand sermon of my life and have made me the person I am today. Pekudei just might be a good time to begin collecting those sacred nuggets, remembering them, appreciating them, gathering them together, and perhaps even writing them down. Who knows? It might someday become a bestseller, or, at the very least, a treasured collection of golden memories for your family to be passed down from generation to generation. Shabbat Shalom, and it's good to be back.